Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Hey. How you doing, Mike?
I am feeling great tonight, Wendy. I'll tell you that. I'm excited. I've got a next time that you guys will hear from me, I will just have completed my first half marathon.
Oh, that's right. You've been getting ready for this all year.
So that was my fitness goal for the beginning of 2015 was
I remember talking to you about that, and you were doing the vegan diet, and how's everything going?
Everything's going excellently. So I'm on par to have hopefully my fastest half marathon yet. So
great. Have you learned anything interesting from your training for this particular one? Or
yes, I have. The less I drink, the better I feel. That was weird.
How shocking that is.
Yeah, I was like, that's not fair.
Well, it's a good lesson for us all, I suppose, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm going to reward myself with a couple of craft beers next weekend after I finish the race.
Oh, that sounds like a nice reward.
Yes.
Although you better have someone to cart you home.
Yes, I will. My
your tolerance is going to be about zero.
Be pretty weak. So I'll make sure to keep it safe. But no, I'm really looking forward to that. So
well, that's wonderful. And that's when is that? The Saturday or Sunday?
That's Sunday. It's it's called the Hypothermic Half Marathon, and it's in Minneapolis, and then in some locations in Canada.
And the weather forecast is supposed to be
well, it should be a little warmer over the weekend. If it was anything like it was this past weekend, then we'll be running in negative temperatures, and that's not something I'm looking forward to.
Oh. Wow, that sounds difficult.
Yeah,
challenging, if you will.
It's hard to keep the breath going when Dr. Freeze has just has his icy grip on side of your lungs.
Indeed, but Mike, you're a Wisconsin native. You've lived, you've grown up here, lived here your whole life, so I'm confident that you have what it takes to withstand the cold and to be victorious.
Thank you.
Get that finish line, beat everyone, win the race.
I'm glad someone has the confidence for me. I appreciate that. So
you'll do great, I'm sure. But good luck to you, and we'll look forward to hearing about it next week when you get back. And
if there's
survived it.
If there's no podcast next week, you people will know why.
There will be a podcast.
Yes, there will be. I've been working on that. This weekend, I had a real good time. We were in the studio yesterday.
Yes, we were. Recording studio for Sunspot, new songs. And some of the songs, well, in fact, all of the songs are ones that we wrote that were inspired by this podcast, by topics from this podcast.
And that's what we'll be doing for a lot of the releases coming up now. So if you guys have any particular songs that you like in the audience, if you hear something and you think it's great and you're like, man, I'd like to hear a really revved up version of that, let us know. We'll definitely keep that in consideration because we're looking at, we'd like the most, popular songs from the podcast to be the ones that we really lay down and nail in the studio.
And it'll be fun to release those and share those with everybody.
It is. And the other thing I was excited about over the weekend was getting another 5-star review in iTunes.
Yes, I saw that. I was so happy. And, the kind reviewer who gave us 5 stars didn't leave a comment, so we don't have a name, so we can't give him a shout out, unfortunately. But to the anonymous listener who gave us 5 whole stars, thank you. And you're helping us reach our goal for February, which is what, Mike?
4 5-star reviews.
Yes, 4 new reviews.
Right, that's right. So the thing is, though, anybody leaving a 5-star review with a comment, we turn that comment into a song. So
that's right.
It's your chance to be immortalized in music by Sunspot. We will do that on the See You on the Other Side podcast.
It's like a singing telegram of a shout out. So
exactly.
If you'd care to help us reach our goal, we still have a couple weeks left in February. So we're going for 3 more. We're a little bit behind schedule, but sometimes the tortoise right at the end starts to sprint, takes over and wins.
That's right. That's the rally. That's the rally that comes in the last couple weeks of the month. So that's where we're going. So
that's right.
You're listening to it. Just come on there, go on iTunes, leave a little comment, and we'll turn it into a song.
Oh, thank you.
And we appreciate them.
All right. Well, before we talk any more about the past. Let's talk about the future, which is what you're about to hear, my friends. And that is Mike doing another spectacular interview. So tell us a little bit about this week's interviewee, Mike, if you would.
Well, this was something, when I heard about this book, I knew it would be perfect for our podcast. And I knew something that it would be a book that I'd be completely fascinated in, and I was. And it's a book called Season of the Witch, How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll.
Oh, that sounds really interesting.
And Season of the Witch is the name of a Donovan song, released right at the height of, the summer of love and the hippie movement and things like that.
That's the must be the season of the witch.
Yeah, that's right. It's like, remember every little stitch. Must be this. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that particular, we can't sing too much of it, or we're gonna have to pay Donovan royalties.
Right. Or we'll get yanked from YouTube or whatever.
Right. So, but the cool thing is that the book it really goes deep into the culture and the research in it. I think it's got a lot of research that I haven't read before. It even, how we talked about Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil at the crossroads?
Yes.
That actually, the myth wasn't about Robert Johnson. I mean, it is now, but originally it wasn't about Robert Johnson. It was about a different blues artist. And since Robert Johnson was such a huge figure in the Delta blues, people just started associating him with that myth.
I thought it was Ralph Macchio.
Right. Ralph Macchio has he's got his own sort of mythology surrounding him, the Karate Kid. But it's we talk about that in the interview, and I liked talking about the history. And he goes he talks about the slaves and the spirituals and how they brought the elements of animism and African religion combined with the Christianity, the Protestantism of the slave owners, and then in New Orleans, they combined it with the Catholicism of the French settlers and putting it all together. And this book really goes deep into that kind of mysticism and how that's shaped our relationship with the music.
Very cool. And I'm excited to hear this now. You got me pumped up.
And it was fun talking to him. I just found out I had a lot in common with him. So he was a little older than we are. He grew up he came more of age in the late 70s and early 80s. And he starts talking about how, Black Sabbath and how he got interested in things like Dungeons and Dragons. And that's what got him a little bit into the occult. Not that Dungeons and Dragons gets you into the occult. I mean, that
you just totally went there, dude.
Yeah. But how, they used some of that occult symbolism in the games and stuff, and how musicians use that occult symbolism, really started introducing that to the mainstream in the late 1960s and early 70s. And so once you get into that, Peter Bebergal, who is the author of Season of the Witch, the man does his research, and he really knows what he's talking about. So it was a lot of fun to talk to him, and when the time was up and stuff, I still had a million questions for him. So I think we're going to have him back. But let's start with this one. And I think people are really going to enjoy it, and they're going to learn some stuff about music that they hadn't learned before.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for doing such a good job of picking these people's brains, Mike. You're quite the interviewer, I have to say. I've enjoyed hearing you get the best out of these guys. So let's see what you did here.
Awesome. Well, enough talk. Let's go. I'm here with Peter Bebergal, who authored an awesome book that is right up our alley here at See You on the Other Side. It's called Season of the Witch, How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll. And it's about exactly the kind of things that we talk about in the show. And we've got Peter with us today, and we're gonna ask him about it. So, Peter, how you doing today on a fine Wednesday?
Good, Mike. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Now, where are you located?
I live in Massachusetts, and we just got hit pretty hard with 2 storms.
Okay, so you guys got it too. In the Midwest, we just had the big snowstorm. So, but you guys had the storm of the century, right? Isn't that what they were talking about?
Well, they always say that, but I'm always amused when New Englanders act surprised every winter that it's going to snow.
Right, it's north.
Yeah, so I think if you've only lived here for 5 years, maybe you can be panicked every year. But for those that have been here at least 10 to 15, should have sort of figured out how to weather it, as the saying goes.
Right. Now, you're not originally from Massachusetts, right? In your book, you talk about growing up in Florida.
Well, I was born in Massachusetts, but then we moved to Florida and lived there for about 5 years during the mid-'70s, and then moved back to Massachusetts.
Okay. So you did have a few years off.
Yes. Yep. And those were sort of, I think, in many ways, the most important in terms of forming my weird consciousness, as it were, were those years in Florida. That's where I discovered Dungeons and Dragons. It's where I became sort of obsessed with monster movies and with paranormal and occult phenomena. It all sort of happened, and the 70s was a weird time anyways, and I think
Yes, it
Florida is already extra weird, so those things together for a young kid who was enamored with these things, it was sort of a perfect storm.
Absolutely. No, I love. There's always excellent stories that come out of Florida. It's always that's where we had what was the big bath salts? Was Florida?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah,
there's always great
I'll
stories.
give you a quick story about one of my first encounters with role playing and that culture.
Excellent.
I bought my D&D game at a store called The Complete Strategist, which was on Sterling Avenue in Hollywood, Florida. And the guy who worked there was this very soft-spoken, very tall, long-haired, big, thick glasses with very long fingernails, very sharply manicured. And I didn't understand at first why he would want his nails that long until I started playing war games and realized you really needed the fingernails to be able to pick up those little die-cut pieces.
Oh, yeah.
For those massive, war games like Panzer Blitz and all those. And so my parents used to drop me off there on Sundays, every Sunday, and I would hang out in the back room hoping somebody would come by and want to play D&D. And rarely anybody ever did. And one day this kid came by. I thought he was a little bit older than me, and so I was 12, 11 or 12 years old.
Okay.
And this kid came and he said, well, I know somebody who plays. Why don't you come with me and we'll go and play with this guy? And so my parents, assuming I was just at the store for a couple of hours, I left in a stranger's car and drove into some weird rundown part of Hollywood. Not that most of it wasn't rundown, but
right.
And he knocked on some guy's apartment, and the guy didn't answer, and then he drove me back to the store. And I always have this terrible fear, of what could have happened.
Right, what was going to be in that guy's apartment?
But there was something also about that culture, and I think it speaks, sort of to overall about these kinds of things, that there is, especially in the early days when there weren't a lot of people who are interested in things like role-playing games or the occult or, horror movies and things, that you always felt a kind of instant rapport with people who did. And so there was kind of maybe a naive trust.
Absolutely.
That we often had around engaging in these, these communities. But you know what? When there wasn't anybody else to play with, and I was the weird, kid to play D&D in my school, and this guy comes along and says that he knows somebody who wants to play, I mean, how could I not take him up on that?
Absolutely. That's funny. You talk about the instant rapport that people have. I think that today geek culture is, these guys are just spoiled.
Oh yeah, yep.
It's like, oh yeah, we got comic book shows on TV. The Avengers are cool.
Yeah.
Like all this stuff. Like you just are completely spoiled. I grew up near Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, so where TSR was based.
Oh wow!
So I remember, like making my parents, like one time we were in Lake Geneva, and I'm like, can we drive by the office and just, check it out, like to see where all of these books that I had been reading come from, and like where Gary Gygax, where he sat down and did his business. And I was disappointed. It just looked like an office in a strip mall.
Right, exactly. It wasn't a castle.
No, I thought it was gonna be something epic, like flags or a moat or a
right.
Obviously, I realized that these were regular guys. I just thought it would be less looking like just like the Chinese restaurant in the strip mall or something like that. So, but I had to take a little pilgrimage to see, where all these books were written. And because it was weird at the time, if we played D&D inside at recess or something, the teacher might be like, hey, why don't you guys go out there and play kickball? It's like, well, because I'm sick of getting my ass kicked and I'd rather just play something I enjoy.
Exactly. So, when I was writing Season of the Witch, I think it was very nostalgic for me too. Even though, I tried to maintain some objectivity, but the truth of the matter is this is stuff that I love and stuff I grew up with. So it was definitely, I think, a book that I, in some ways, had wanted to write since I was, 8.
Sure. And so if you're into, horror movies, paranormal, the occult, and that was at the time too. There were shows like In Search of, like That's Incredible would do stories about werewolves and things like that. And that's kind of, the occult and the paranormal had its own, little subculture in the 1970s. And, so you got into that. What brought you into, you talk in the book a little bit how you'd been listening to pop music, or, you talk about the Bay City Rollers or the Bee Gees or disco. What got you into the stuff, Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and Floyd and things like that?
Well, I grew up the youngest of 4. My older siblings were 10, 7, and 5 years older than me. Mm. So in some ways, I felt like I lived in a house of adults.
Okay.
When I was 10, my brother's 17. That's a huge difference in age at that time in your life.
Absolutely. My sister was 7 years older than I am, too. So I completely understand where you're coming from.
And so his culture, and yeah, exactly. And so their cultural markers were very different. And they also, my brother engaged in the world in a much more mature way. So I remember, catching him smoking outside the bedroom window. And, I was terrified. And I remember, him putting on cologne, right. And I had no idea why you would want to put on cologne when you're 16 years old, when I was 9. But he loved music. All my family did, but my brother in particular, mm-hmm. loved rock and roll. And he used to play stuff for me. And he would always figure out, as much as his life growing up was about teasing me, it was also about trying to figure out ways to scare me, whether it was, using his ventriloquist dummy, hiding it in a closet with a cigarette dangling out of its mouth or something like that, or playing, Revolution 9 from the White Album, or even Alice Cooper songs, or showing me the inside open artwork on the sleeve of the David Bowie's Diamond Dog.
Right.
And playing this, We Are the Dead from that album. And it was that kind of fear. It was the same reason why I love monster movies. So mm-hmm. I was both, and I sort of say in the book, kind of repelled and attracted at the same time. But with music, with rock and roll in particular, there was a sexual aspect of it that I missed, I guess, in the vampire movies that I watched.
Right.
There was much more, even though I didn't understand what sex was. It was there was something libidinous about this that elevated it in a way that made it feel more real, maybe, or it activated feelings in me that were more than just fear. There was sort of an erotic element to it.
Sure.
And so that definitely like I say, raises the level of attraction for for somebody in pre-adolescent. I think a lot of people encounter rock and roll in that way, and that's part of its power. I think is the sexual force of it, particularly in the '70s when with the Rolling Stone album cover where you could unzip the zipper
Right.
on his jeans. I mean, come on, when I was 7 years old, my God, that was just mind-boggling. But because I was always interested, like I said, in the arcane, that there was also all of that wrapped up in the music that was very easy to find. You didn't have to dig very deep to find those symbols. And so it made sense that as somebody who was already interested in these things and then is starting to kind of come of age sexually, rock and roll was the perfect place for those things to meet.
I think that's a really good point, and that's something in modern music. A lot like rock and roll doesn't have that place that it once did in the culture when we talk about sexual awakening.
Right.
It really, the songs were a lot more explicit. Like, even in the 90s and stuff, you wouldn't, the sexuality of the Rolling Stones, the really intense stuff, that was replaced by rap. And with graphic rap lyrics and with, dance songs that were, more about sex. And rock and roll was, you had bands like Weezer.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, Patti Smith feels more authentically erotic to me than Beyonce does. Mm-hmm. And part of it is that rock was still sort of finding its early ways to agitate, and sex was obviously a big part of that, and so it was still verboten,
Right.
Still. But I also think that there was something that was still dangerous about rock and roll.
Absolutely. We still had the World War II generation parents were still
right.
in there. And, this was fearsome to them. We laugh now. I mean, parents that grew up in the 80s and stuff have a joke about their Motley Crue albums with pentagrams on them. And so it's when you talk about Satanism, it almost seems like a joke. But to the World War II generation, seeing mystical symbols and everything like that was different to them.
That's right. And if you were a band back then and you've already felt like you were pushing up against the mainstream, that you were rebelling, what better way to amplify that than to seek out a spiritual identity that's also in opposition to mainstream values? Right.
Well, and you really, what I like about the book is that it's, it doesn't just go into the really more overt occultism of the 1970s when you get into heavy metal and everything. It starts with the hippies. It starts with the Beat Generation and the Beatles, and the occultism in there is everything. It's everything against. It's everything against the generation that came before it. And I like that you start going deep. I mean, even naming it after the Donovan song, it gives a context to it that this movement in the culture started much earlier than by the time it went mainstream.
That's right. And by the time it went mainstream, the devil was sort of ascendant as the symbol of
Right.
rock's occult power. But that's in the history of rock, that's a later phenomena. I mean, obviously, rock and roll has been characterized as the devil's music by those outside,
Right.
Since Elvis. But in terms of what the spiritual intentions or the creative intentions or even the marketing intentions of musicians and producers and labels was much more, I think, about kind of mystical, non-demonic occult sensibility that I think really resonated for people, especially in the 1960s, because those images and those ideas, I think in many ways gave a language to understand mainly the LSD experience, which
Oh, sure.
is already inscrutable. And so I don't know what it is. I mean, certainly some people see Jesus on acid, but there seems to be something particularly relatable between the psychedelic experience and the Eastern mystical experience. I think it has a lot to do with things like ego dissolution and feeling at one with things, maybe. And if you look at William James's description of the mystical experience, these definitions, which are now actually being used in some ways by psilocybin studies that went on at Johns Hopkins. They went back and looked at those again because they seem to be these categories of experience that transcended your religious identity. So whether you're Christian or Jewish or whatever, if you take psilocybin and you had a mystical experience, there seem to be these common elements to the experience.
And that's we talked about LSD in a previous episode, and I think you're really getting at something when you talk about ego dissolution in Western culture. It's just not, even in spirituality, it's just not something that is based in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Like it's always based on the survival of the personality.
That's right. But even Western esotericism is about will for the most part.
Mm-hmm. So I think when you have these experiences where all of a sudden you're at one with the universe and everything because you took this, it's meditation that can lead to that as well. And meditation is something that's right out of the Eastern tradition versus the Western.
That's right. So again, it has to do with if you feel like what you're doing is rebellious in your art or in your lifestyle, and the church or the moral majority is telling you that what you're doing is suspect or demonic,
right?
And you say, well, then I'm not going to engage with that spiritual identity anymore. You're going to turn to other things. And I think it made sense, again, that in the 60s, Eastern mysticism tended to be more the way in which people went. Now, certainly there was a huge influx also of Western occultism, tarot cards, and magic, as it were, particularly for many. And there was maybe just a big mix of things, too. I think the person who meditated also used tarot cards, and that's sort of part of occult culture today, but it really started then when people were so hungry for something.
The new age.
Yes. Which is really, I think, comes out later because I think that the new age kind of loses its rebellious quality that was more something that we saw in the 60s. However, before you know it, those images and those ideas were being used, in Pepsi commercials.
Right. And, well, we in the book, it talks a lot about, it gets in deep to the symbolism. And I love how, you go into not just the Eastern mysticism, but you start with the very basis and you go into voodoo and you go into animism and the African origins of, slave music and how that went to blues and how that went to rock and roll. But there's in your book, Peter, you say that Robert Johnson wasn't the one who went to the crossroads, and I knew right then that's like, okay, now we have a guy who did some deep research. How did you find that out? Because when you look on the internet or read any of their book, Robert Johnson and the Crossroads, obviously besides the song, but selling his soul to the devil are almost synonymous.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you read blues historians, you're going to find that more. And it wasn't that hard to find, I guess, if you looked. But I really wanted to discover the roots of that story. And there were a number of blues historians that said, actually, there was a fellow named Tommy Johnson, no relation, who had this kind of haunting voice. And his brother, I think it was, actually was the one who sort of started this rumor that he received his musical chops as it were, from some encounter with a figure at the crossroads. And it was later applied to Robert Johnson, but it could have been that he didn't even know in his lifetime
Right.
that was part of his mythology. But he had a song called Crossroad Blues. So maybe somebody just got the name Johnson and misunderstood, or maybe somebody really was trying to reinvent the myth for some reason. But what's interesting about the idea at the crossroads is it's not even clear, if you look at the history of that story, that it's necessarily for people who talked about an encounter with some supernatural figure at the crossroads, that would necessarily have been the devil. Because if you were somebody who was sort of swimming, as it were, in the New Orleans voodoo mythology and folklore, you would encounter some of these Haitian and African deities that were crossroad deities, trickster deities, sort of like Hermes. They are the intermediaries between the spirit world and human beings. And the crossroads is the symbol of where you might encounter one of these deities, because they're messengers.
Right, okay.
But all these figures become demonized, as it were, by, and there's no single thread to follow how this happened. It happens because black music is seen as demonic, because African culture is seen as demonic or barbaric,
Right.
because maybe we know that at one time the word by a fellow who was translating the Bible into Yoruban used one of the deities as a stand-in for the devil in the Bible. And that had a big role to play in how this all gets, so it's all a synthesis of myth, of rumor, of racism, of religious oppression, and eventually, like happens even some would say with pagan deities in Europe, horned or trickster or messenger deities suddenly become Satan or the devil.
Right. They all term, whether it's Pan or Dionysus or whatever, they all
Right.
just become the Christian version of the devil.
That's right. And in this case, in the South, it was Legba, so you have these things happen again. I use the word suddenly, and I shouldn't have. I mean, it's really a long process of like a crucible of culture, that makes this happen. But it's fascinating to have traced it and to see that in its earliest places, popular music was seen as suspect. And if you are, in particular, popular music was something that people would dance to. And if you're dancing, that's where the devil lies in wait, because there's nothing more sexual, right, than dancing.
Right. The temptation of the flesh.
That's right.
And, and I really enjoyed the fact that it's like, okay, maybe, Robert Johnson, it was conventional wisdom. And that's the kind of thing, the anecdotal evidence that we've all looked at for, ever, it feels like.
Yep.
Might be completely different than what blues historians had to say.
That's right, but it's still a powerful myth, and the fact that it is a synthesis of very different stories doesn't dilute its power. Now we understand the history of it, and we can see that maybe we were mistaken somewhere along the way, but that myth of Robert Johnson, one of the most influential guitarists, particularly for early rock and roll musicians, to take on the mantle, right, of having sold your soul to the devil, it's just perfect for what happened to the culture of rock and roll.
Now, in your book, you talk about, everybody from, King Diamond to the Beatles to, Led Zeppelin. And Aleister Crowley, obviously, is a character that shows up again and again as he does in any occult conversation about the 20th century. But which of these artists do you really think got into it more than others? Like, who is using it as marketing and maybe like, oh man, this just looks really cool on the backdrop, versus who do you think actually was into it when you did your research?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question. So there's a couple of ways to think about that. I think there are those who maybe considered themselves practicing occultists. Maybe Jinx Dawson of the band Coven, up to, the British underground bands like Coil and Psychic TV. But did Mick Jagger, who hung around with Kenneth Anger, was he a practicing occultist? Probably not. But certainly he hobnobbed with people who were into that stuff and liked the aura of Mephistophelian, sensibility that it gave him.
Right.
But then you have somebody like, Alice Cooper. I'm sorry, I'm thinking Ozzy Osbourne. Alice Cooper's another person to mention, but
right.
But I was thinking, I wanted to say Ozzy Osbourne, who was able to stage something quite, whether you like his music or not, and I'm actually not a big fan, but I prefer Sabbath, but who would stage these amazing shows where he would descend from a throne and walk down the stairs while flames are exploding behind him, and he would have his upside down cross. And, did he practice spells? No, I doubt it. However, that construct itself is a kind of magic that's extremely powerful, insofar as even maybe at that moment Ozzy takes on this persona, and the audience for that hour and a half, 2 hours with encore that they're watching him are hypnotized by that and accept that there is something almost arcanely transcendent going on there. But once the show is over and Ozzy's back in his dressing room and people are driving, trying to get out of the parking lot, the spell is sort of over. But I think real magic, in how I use that term, is something that happened there between the musician and the audience at the moment that the performance is taking place. And the fact that he uses occult imagery and symbols only prove the point of the power of that imagery and those symbols to help, elevate everybody's feelings about what's happening in the moment.
Sure, they transcend the moment because of the frenzy they get whipped in, and part of it is using those symbols and that imagery, and Ozzy is the Prince of Ozzy, when I was growing up, I remember we'd just be like, oh man, Ozzy Osbourne, like that guy bites the heads off of chickens, he's crazy, he's obviously a drug addict, and I bet he worships the devil. And then, you watch him in the Osbournes, and when you talk about Ozzy after the show performing some kind of spell, I mean, I don't know that in the 1980s Ozzy could have, gotten dressed without help.
Exactly. So, but again, does it matter that he believed or didn't believe, or that it's sort of irrelevant to my overall sort of point of the book, which is that there's something about this imagery, these symbols, these ideas that married perfectly to the rebellious heart of rock and roll, and I think for all intent and purposes changed and shaped the music and even the pop music that we listen to today. When we think about somebody like, I talked about this before and in the book about Madonna's Super Bowl appearance in 2012. That's not very different from Ozzy Osbourne's show in terms of a spectacle that is one that conjures up a sense of some, occult mystery taking place. And I think she smartly understands the power of those images, and how they activate some part of us that responds sometimes excitedly, sometimes with paranoia, and sometimes with, a shrug of the shoulders.
Right, and it's interesting how these, even 20 years ago, some of these images that would be more shocking. I mean, I remember Marilyn Manson on the MTV Music Awards, and he's got like an upside down cross or an upside down American flag or just something ridiculous that people were still shocked by at the time, like, oh, what's he doing? And now mainstream artists are just, like you said, they can bring that part of the show into something like the Super Bowl, which over 1 billion people will be watching.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, people, it may not be as overt in a way where, we I mean, there's still conspiracy theories that will tell you that Madonna's part of the Illuminati, but that's, but that's different from the way in which people were responding to Motley Crue, which was, sort of national outrage.
Right. I mean, they outrage at how much makeup the guys used.
Right.
They should have had an outrage at how they couldn't hit the notes in a live show, but that's a completely different.
Exactly.
Some of the other stuff that I like in the book is when you talk about science fiction's influence. Michael Moorcock on rock and roll bands like Hawkwind, and even down to, you talk about the invention of the synthesizer and Robert Moog and everything like that. And that's something that's not as explored as much, because science fiction is its own set of imagery and its own set of rituals that might not have a basis in thousands of years of human tradition, but certainly it's as for us that grew up with Star Wars and Star Trek, it certainly is as burned into our minds as fantasy or the devil or anything like that. I mean, with Star Wars, with Jedis, come on, that's its own religion now.
Exactly. But I think that what happened in the 70s, particularly around the time of with prog rock and Hawkwind and bands like that, is that the sort of failure of the hippie mysticism, which led, I think, to overblown devil incursion in the 70s for a little while, as much as fun as some of it was.
Right.
But then there's, again, this need for something more hopeful. And I think New Age mysticism is a big part of that. And New Age mysticism really does involve, kind of UFO as angels. It involves a kind of sense of cosmic consciousness, which has its own sort of space age imagery attached to ideas like that. And so I think with bands who are looking more towards the future, maybe in a science fictional way, but also in a kind of space age mysticism, that it's with a new kind of consciousness that the human race will be saved. And you add sort of these sort of outlandish science fiction elements to it, and it becomes something really, I think, glorious if you're into that kind of thing.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Right. It's so much fun. But I do think that there was something sort of intentional about the future. And, we think about New Age music, which is very much organized around electronics, not traditional instruments, but instruments of the future. So here is a kind of spirituality that might even borrow from some ancient ideas in terms of, the Hermeticism or things like that.
Right.
But is using this sort of future materials, future methods to express that. And the synthesizer became a very important part of expressing a New Age mysticism. And Robert Moog himself talked about his instrument in these very strangely mystical terms about how he and the instrument were just a vessel whereby sort of the universe was speaking through him, and using musicians also as just tools to activate some part of this universal consciousness. So even the inventor of this instrument understood it in these extremely mystical terms.
And that's really interesting, because I think that kind of connects between, old school mysticism and the New Age, in that, there are certain themes that are just arising from this art and this expression, and whether it's the imagery of, the chariots of the gods, or
Yep.
it's the imagery of angels. They're both kind of the same theme, and that's humans transcending themselves in some way. And I was just wondering, what do you think are some of those basic themes that the imagery finds almost every time? And it doesn't matter if it's 1935 with the old blues artists, or it's 2015. With the modern hip hop.
Yeah, well, I think it gets to the heart of, I think, what the occult is, if we want to use that word in a very broad sense. And in the book, I call it the occult imagination as a way to broaden it even more. But I think it's about human beings feeling like they have some control over their relationship to the divine. That there doesn't need to be an intermediary like a priest or a rabbi. That you can have this direct experience. Maybe you need certain formulas to be able to do that. Maybe the tarot cards are a way to divine some knowledge of the divine's fate. But whatever it is, it's about human beings, yes, transcending earthly sort of forms towards them having this immediate and direct, and in some ways under their own control, experience with the divine or with some supernatural force.
Okay, and so that's the human's understanding, maybe the purpose of the universe and everything like that, depending on whether we use science for it or whether we use, quote unquote, magic for it. I love how the book gets into that, and I love the way you put as the occult imagination, instead of having it just be the occult, which just conjures up every kind of, I know if I say the word occult to my mother, she'd immediately be like, oh, that's just so weird.
Right.
And, have the little Catholic school girl in her would have like these images of, some dark sexual rituals and things. We talk about that imagery, and we talk about that transcendence, and we talked about concerts. Which concerts have you been to, heard about, or would have wished you were at, or festivals from the 60s to today that you think might have been the most exciting, that you're like, man, I was 11 years old in 1978 or whatever, or, I wish I could have been at this particular Black Sabbath concert in England.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, mainly because they're one of my favorite bands, is King Crimson at Hyde Park in 1969, opening for the Rolling Stones. And there's some footage online. I don't know if it's complete. I think some of it might be dubbed from another live show, but you can see there's a couple of moments when they start with 21st Century Schizoid Man. I don't know if you know that song.
Oh, yeah.
where the hippies in the audience look absolutely shocked. Like they can't figure out what's happening. But eventually they are sort of elevated by it. I think that would have been a show to see. I think really any of the very early, the first 3 records of Led Zeppelin shows would have been something to have seen. Just in terms, again, of these moments that absolutely changed, I think, rock and roll's sort of history. And, of course, Bowie's Ziggy tour would have been something to have got to witness live.
Well, you talk in the book how like he broke up the band on stage.
Yes. Yep. He said, "Okay, everybody, good night. It's the last last stop on the tour. The band did not know that was what he was planning.
And and it's so ridiculous that you're thinking like, I wish I would have been at that show. Like that. What kind of legend would that be? Like, I was at the show when the Spiders from Mars, dissolved.
That's right. I mean, for other people, it's when Bob Dylan plugged in. That's not my top one. But. Right. But
no, that's a great thing. And you talk about that show at Hyde Park, and King Crimson and the Rolling Stones. Like, they're both, we both kind of relegate them to the classic rock era. But, when you think about how really different the Rolling Stones represented, that rebelliousness of the 1960s, of, the Beatles versus Stones, and that.
And of a really blues-based rock and roll.
Right. I was going to just, like, that reimagining of the Delta blues that the Rolling Stones did. And then you have prog rock as King Crimson. Is there any? They're bringing in the progressive movement, which would feature album covers with spaceships on it, and you talk about Yes a lot in the book, and their album covers and everything. And prog really took that new age and occult kind of imagery, sensibility, and brought it to the forefront in the 70s and everything. Think about Rush's album 2112.
Oh yeah, with the cover, with the pentagram and I always forget the name of that image. Is it
Oh, I know. It's like a naked boy in front of the pentagram.
Yeah, exactly. But I think there's a name for that, for the figure in the pentagram, and I always forget what that is.
Yeah,
I'm trying to get it while we talk. But anyways, certainly, yes, these are some essential moments. And maybe, it got to a point where it was a little excessive, and punk was a very important corrective to all of that. It got a little too big for its britches.
Right. Oh,
as
yeah.
it were,
So, then it was changed. I mean, how do you be rebellious against people who are awesome at their instruments? Chris Squire or John Anderson. You have to have somebody who can't even play his instrument, like Sid Vicious.
Yeah, but really, I think it's even less quote egregious than that. I think it was about let's go back to play like Elvis Presley. Let's just play 3 chords. Let's just play rock and roll again.
Right, and get down to it. It's very basics. I mean, and think about the Ramones, who basically the founders of the punk movement, and their songs were just revved up, 1950s.
That's right, absolutely. Yeah, I've been listening to the Ramones with my son, and so talking to him about, at the time, even though at the time what it sounded like that they were doing was radical, even by rock and roll terms, it wasn't radical, and now it sounds fairly tame.
Right, singing about going to the beach and meeting girls and things like that. It's like, well, might as well be a Bill Haley song.
Exactly.
You brought in Elvis, and one thing I thought was interesting is that I didn't realize Elvis was from the Pentecostal tradition.
I guess it's the Assembly Church of God more specifically, but yes, it's a part of that larger tradition.
And we should explain that kind of tradition and why it's, anybody that grew up in like I did in the Midwest, like Catholic church, which is very, staid and, half, Latin, or when the group sings, it's not very earth-shattering, let's say. No. So can you describe a little bit of some of that Pentecostal tradition to kind of give some context?
Well, I think it's, in some ways it was the white church's attempt to have gospel, to have some actual fervent sense of their worship. There's a wonderful thing that I discovered, and from another a really important book on African American religion, which I don't have the title of the book right now, but I quote in the book where an early Pentecostal minister of a white Pentecostal church is trying to get his congregation to show a little, energy in their worship. Mm-hmm. And he says to them, we can't let the devil keep all this good rhythm. So even then, there was an idea that when you did worship like that, you were bumping up against the devil, because in some ways what he was saying was that that's how black people worship. And we know that there are African traditions that, were once barbaric and pagan, but they knew how to worship. So we have to borrow from that. And that became the tradition, this very raucous, I think, the Pentecostals, where you also start to get the, the more, I just lost the word, kind of worship with an extension out of that is sort of like the faith healing and some of the very charismatic Christian churches.
Right, or just the speaking in tongues. People.
Yep.
If you watch YouTube videos of people speaking in tongues, you're like, that feels occult.
Yeah, absolutely.
That absolutely feels mystical, because you're so taken by the Spirit that you are babbling.
That's right. And in African religion, and you have to understand, a lot of this worship was borrowed from what, when the African slaves did, was considered demonic.
Right.
But in the African tradition, when you were worshiping those deities, the spirits, you were possessed, not by God, but by the spirits. And you don their mask, as it were, and we think back to the earliest forms of theater, which were the mystery rites of gods like Dionysus, where you put on the mask of the deity, you became the deity for that moment. And speaking in tongues, I don't think, is very far removed from that idea, which is you take on some likeness of the Spirit, and the Spirit, quote, speaks through you, right?
Right.
It's possession.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it, except by the Holy Spirit versus Pazuzu or whatever.
Exactly. And so this is the church that Elvis was raised in, for all intent and purposes. And so there's this wonderful moment in some interviews where, he says he's accused by his church of singing and dancing like some barbarian. And he says, but I learned it in my church. They taught me how to sing and dance like this.
Right. So he's mystified at the fact that people think that his music is the devil's work, or it's that it's even controversial.
That's right. Because it was certainly considered too black.
Right. And he'd grown up in the tradition where that was trying to be that was trying to make religious ecstasy through dancing.
That's right, and gospel, and yep.
So, so that's just interesting that there is this culture in the South that a lot of us are unfamiliar with, that has mysticism built in, and that goes right into the music, Elvis, that has formed a good portion of our artistic life over the
and
decades.
Little Richard also, who was part of that church growing up.
Yeah, and Little Richard is such a fascinating character too, because he's so back and forth. He's in love with rock and roll, but he also has that strong religious aspect to him in his private life, and the struggle against his own sexuality.
That's right. Yep.
And so that just the things that formed kind of our cultural context from the 1950s and 60s. That they're based in such, speaking in tongues. Just we'll link to it on YouTube, and they'll say like this is part of the things that if you guys think that Aleister Crowley is weird, check this out.
Right, but then other Christian churches would see that as doing the work of the devil. The Lutherans thought the Pentecostals were out of their minds.
And right, and so that's part of the fun of our own cultural wars. That continue obviously to this day with the Hobby Lobby, in the culture wars we have. And
that's right.
Speaking of this day, though, the new millennium. We're talking, and all these seeds are sown, in the early part of in the middle of the 20th century. But in the 21st century, who do you see, and you talk a little bit about this in the book, but who do you see as like carrying the flame for occult imagery, and whether it's rock and roll or whether it's hip hop, for occult imagery in the 21st century?
Well, I think there's a wonderful movement of underground and metal acts that are sort of reigniting some of that stuff, particularly from the 70s. There's a wonderful band named Blood Ceremony, Electric Wizard, of course. Then there's bands that are trucking with a little bit more occult, mystical side of things, like Ohm. I think our important band, Emil Amos, excuse me, is a musician who's involved in a number of bands like Grails and Ohm. Sleep, of course, is one of those sort of sludgy doom metal bands that are doing this kind of thing. But I also think there's just a number of really interesting experimental musicians that continue to embrace some of these ideas, whether only creatively or musically, and not necessarily, again, whether they practice in their own life, it's irrelevant in some ways,
Right.
There's a band, Swans, of course, is an important part of that, modern story. One of my favorite bands right now, who your listeners might not know of, is a Finnish band named Hex Vessel.
Hex Vessel. Okay, we'll have to find them and link to them.
Highly recommend. They're absolutely beautiful. If you want to really feel like a sort of authentic occult goings on, there's something very wonderfully spooky and moving about their music. There's almost too many bands to mention right now. Of course, there's all the people working with the band Sun. The Stephen O'Malley's outfit that does the great drone metal.
Right, and they play in like robes and everything like that.
Exactly. And you talk to, I've interviewed him, and again, for him, it's less about belief and more about mystique and the power of that, and how that becomes part of the relationship between the performer and the audience.
And it's the most mystique, though, is probably, you talk about them in the book, and they've come through Madison a lot, is Ghost BC.
Yes.
Like, they look like, that's a 2015 version of Alice Cooper. It's like Alice Cooper came back.
That's right. However, they can't quite resonate in the same way because it just looks like exactly what you said. It's just the 21st century version of Alice Cooper. So they're always going to be limited by that. I went to see them here in Boston, and it was a terrific show, but there wasn't really a sense of anything actually sinister going on. It's, in fact, kind of poppy metal.
Right. Oh, yeah. It's very popular.
It's very radio friendly, as it were. So, but certainly they figured out how to do the spectacle.
Right. And their music's great, and they're a lot of fun. And they put that, and I think you hit the nail on the head where you said the danger aspect of it. That, Alice Cooper, my dad thought that he defecated on the stage and ate it.
Yes.
He heard something. He's like, what Alice Cooper?
And it must be true, right?
What Alice Cooper did, and my dad's in his late 70s, so he's part of just after the World War II generation, and I'm just like, what? I've got a video right here, and he doesn't do anything of the sort, and he seems like a normal guy and fairly conservative, actually. So all these things that when you talk about in the early 70s, that people, the rumors that went around, are just ridiculous. But what was kind of dangerous is Ghost BC is a Scandinavian band. Yes. And it seems like the black metal, and I don't mean African American or color of skin, I mean directly like the genre of black metal kind of maybe took the imagery a little bit too far in the late 90s and the early 2000s.
Yeah, and I've been criticized actually for not really taking that up in the book much, mainly because I felt sort of shy in the face of another book called Lords of Chaos.
Okay.
Which is really the book to read. Although some say maybe it could have been a little bit more objective, but that's definitely the book to read. There's also a book called Louder Than Hell, which is the oral history of heavy metal that goes into a lot of that. But in any event, yes, certainly. Although, if you look at the sort of Satanism of these black metal bands, again, it's less about. It seems almost less about the actual Antichrist as it does about some kind of Ayn Randian,
Right.
uber libertarianism,
Like Anton LaVey.
Exactly. So it's sort of a strange secular Satanism that uses, again, these ideas and these images to sort of shock and to create a sort of sensibility around the forces that they feel they have arrayed. But again, I don't know if I would necessarily always call it a cult in the way that I would say a band like Coil is a cult, or even the way Sun uses those images.
Right. Well, I mean, and the stuff in Scandinavia got violent. Like they burned churches, and some of these guys killed each other.
That's right, and it evolved so quickly. A lot of it into racism and nationalism. And again, there's always been a relationship between certain occult beliefs and fascism and Nazism. So we could have a whole other story just on that.
Well, you talk about David Bowie's relationship to fascism a little bit.
Yeah,
and you might just explain that for me real quick, because a lot of people be like, David Bowie, the Thin White Duke, is a fascist?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is very important in thinking about David Bowie. I think David Bowie is he's the star of my book for me, because he really was the true alchemist in that he understood how to use his self as a magical instrument, ultimately transforming himself into all these different characters in really, I think, like a true alchemical fashion, really becoming and inhabiting those figures, and all along the way using and reading and thinking about the occult and magic. But Nazism as a idea, not as a political idea, but as a social sense of power and control, and the ability for a single person to have that much influence over an audience or over the masses in the way that Hitler did, I think was very intriguing for Bowie, because I think he saw rock and roll having a very similar power.
Sure, the draw and the attraction and the hero worship.
That's right, and there's a kind of propaganda with the staging that can go along with that. Was David Bowie a Nazi sympathizer? No,
Right.
But he certainly, at one point in his life, I think a very short period of time, saw something romantic about the sort of myth of the Nazi occult, investigations, and again, this sort of power of crowd control. And
so that's just an interesting thing, because when you talk about David Bowie's relationship with fascism, and indeed, Nazism and fascism, and the idea of we talked about elevation, of how people feel that in groups, whether it's a Black Sabbath concert or a billion people watching Madonna and her Kabbalah-esque halftime show at the Super Bowl, it's all the idea of, as humans together through this art, through this imagery, transcending themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that just seems to be the theme, and how all of these different artists from the 1930s till today have used this like weird imagery that's the stuff of horror movies, or the stuff of what churches get together and they talk about how Dungeons and Dragons and everything can
exactly.
poison your mind.
Yep.
So this is fantastic. Peter, we really appreciate you taking the time with us. Where can people find more information about your book and about your writings and just in general about you?
I mean, you can find me on Twitter. I try to keep updated things there. I have a blog, which I don't haven't been updating as much as I used to. But if you just my full name, Peter Bebergal, is my Twitter name, and you can find me there. And I often post things that are going on, either new writings or information about the book. You can also buy the book, hopefully locally, or it certainly can be ordered. And you can get it at any of the online places, and you certainly could probably get it in your library.
And we'll link to all of that in the show notes and everything. And I'll have to have you back sometime because I feel like we just started scratching the surface of like an overview of occultism. And I recommend to everybody, if this interested you at all, dive into the book because it's a launching point and it gets really deep into a lot of these things, and you're going to learn stuff about artists that you love that you never have learned before. So you really enjoy it. So thank you very much for your time, Peter, and we really appreciate it.
It was great. Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Well, that was just fascinating, Mike.
Thank you.
Great job. You guys really covered some interesting things and things that I had no idea about.
Well, that's the idea. Just a little bit of education with your Satan.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like as a rock musician, that knowing those things about other rock musicians and some of their, I don't know, motivations, inspirations, etc. It's just some very fascinating insight.
Right on. Well, I think we should get to the Sunspot Song of the Week, and this is our own little track where we take some occult symbolism and bring it into a song. This one's called Devil Music.
the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
More souls to get me out of game shows and into the big time. Heavy metal, rock, and roll.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at OthersidePodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.